in my opinion, the fact of something being open source is not itself a differentiator. And I'd like to explain why and perhaps offer some reasons for hope. I'm also looking forward to getting a better understanding of what effect this corporate attitude has on the open source developers, represented by Colin, and by the vendors themselves, represented by Diane. And we should have time for Q&A at the end. So open source products are spread throughout the enterprise in Credit Suisse, as I expect is the case in most enterprises. We've already had some stats that show how very likely this is going to be. But of course, so is commercial software, so is in-house code. And in effect, it doesn't actually really matter what the source is, it's what we're actually trying to do, what is best situated to the problem at hand. And that definition of suitability is primarily founded on familiarity, risk, and cost. So if we start with cost, open source products are often brought into an organization because they cost less for similar functionality. Let's travel back in time a little bit. The move from the mainframe towards Unix systems wasn't primarily around licensing. It was because it was possible to buy smaller units, to scale based on need. It was possible with open systems to have an interface that was less dependent on the hardware vendor. I suspect you may have heard similar comments in more recent years around open source itself and around cloud. And then from there, the move from things like Solaris towards Linux had a similar motivation for the enterprise space, running computer systems at a lower cost. Now that move to Linux within the enterprise really only started to scale when there became vendors out there who banks could trust and who could deal with. Companies like Red Hat might be founded on open source and an open source philosophy, but the reason they do a lot of business, the reason they came into banks was because they could speak the corporate language. Maybe they had to learn it. Indeed, within Linux and Intel, Credit Suisse and other organizations spent significant time and effort working on systems with an odd collection of commercial and open source proprietary hardware and software before actually working out what was the best thing to do and to reduce the amount of complication in our environment. One of the things that we've done about making that easier for ourselves is to make it more of a vendor problem. For example, when we started playing with Hadoop, we looked at the open source product. We fairly quickly moved on to looking at distributions, and then we looked at the vendors providing those distributions. And indeed, one of the vendors we were shortlisted essentially was dismissed from the process because they just could not talk the corporate talk. We could not actually have a conversation that made sense to both of us, that had nothing to do with the distribution itself. So moving on to risk, there are two aspects I'd like to talk about. The first one is licensing. Open source licensing is something that we used to worry about a lot, but we don't so much. And we've already talked a little about legal and lawyers and so forth. But and in the early days, you know, there was a great deal of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And it was about the viral nature of open source and the fear that corporations felt that if they started using these products, then proprietary business functionality would be exposed to the eyes of the world. Now, there are some licenses that still do worry us a bit. Things like the Afro license, for example, but in most cases that perceived threat has retreated. Partly this is because there are better, more commonly shared definitions of what open source means. We understand the most common licenses that are out there. Partly it's because as an organisation we built up that legal expertise to actually understand those licenses, to know how to deal with them, to have a cookbook that says if it's a GPL we can do this with it, if it's an Apache license we can do that with it. And partly it's because our third-party relationships actually give our corporate warriors a bit more comfort. Now, the other element of risk is the impact of issues in the software itself. There comes a point in the process where some of this stuff becomes critical to the business. Do we really want to bet the bank on software which has no support contract? Can we, as a large-scale commercial corporation, put ourselves in a position where we don't have a vendor on the other end of the line? Both the phone line, the support line, probably not phones anymore, and the contract line. Now, perhaps it's a futile view. If you compare, for example, the timelines for patching WannaCry and Heartbleed as profile examples, the fact that one came from a corporate organisation and the other one came from an open source product didn't make much difference. And in fact, there was definitely, that you could consider much better outcomes for the open source product in that case. And perhaps sometimes a contract is something of a comfort blanket. I see how much pressure we need to bear on a big organisation to fix a patch that matters to us, but not to them, or to actually get an enhancement request to go from an idea that we have to something which is in their product. Now, when the product is open source, yes, potentially we can just fix it ourselves. We can just add that patch. And there are people in our environment who can use and manage an open source product, who can deal with the documentation, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, who can apply and perhaps even supply patches. So it may seem strange that we choose not to do this when that is the bread and butter of the development organisation inside the bank for our own in-house applications. Now the difference here is that we see some code as part of our business, our intellectual property, and increasingly other software isn't considered business differentiating. And it's interesting looking at the presentation we've already had, which said that non-business differentiating software is a good reason to make it open source. Now, for us, it's a good reason to make it somebody else's problem. That doesn't necessarily matter whether it's closed or open source, whether we're using Veritas Cluster Server or Pacemaker to do our clustering. And we, as an organisation, don't think we need to employ people for the expertise that they will rarely need. So when the answer to the support question is Slack, Stack Overflow, and a mailing list, then nervousness is going to result from our corporate worries. I suspect that you will agree that it's not a valid strategy to hope that a bug or issue will be fixed. The organisation wants to know what the mitigation risk is. And that tends to mean providing a commercial intermediary, working with a commercial intermediary. Does it really matter that Linux in itself is open source? That Hadoop is Apache Hadoop? When someone from the MariaDB sales team comes to me and says their product is open source, what are they actually trying to tell me? I mean, perhaps it's the code that the code can't be made proprietary. But even MySQL's ownership by Oracle hasn't removed the GPL from that product. Now, to be fair, both MariaDB and Postgres have structures defined to make sure that no single company can have the overall ownership of the software assets. But again, what difference does that make to me? I've seen the argument that I can go somewhere else to get my commercial support for an open source product, but when one support organisation already has the majority of the capability, why would I go to a junior player? There is a further concern that a small vendor couldn't bear the weight of a large corporate. And compare that with an open source product where there is no commercial intermediary at all. Indeed, taking significant amounts of software from such sources might even be seen as poor risk management by a regulator. Now thirdly, familiarity. Across the enterprise, people are playing the new toys. Whether it's Kubernetes, Cassandra, SaltStack, Chrome, we do see things coming into the enterprise from diverse sources. And we are building mechanisms to allow developers to experiment without immediately opening up the organisation to the risk of direct downloads from the internet. As a result, Credit Suisse staff can now play with software before we take a strategic decision. Of course, most major vendors I can think of will give you a trial license for a product, but there's always a certain amount of friction with that. And before that stage, it's a lot easier to put free and open source software into the hands of those outside the corporates, those who don't engage with the major enterprise, but some of whom will move into a business like ours. So to conclude, I mentioned familiarity, risk, and cost at the start. I focus more on risk and cost, as these are the more obvious priorities for the business. Cost generally benefits open source, while risk generally means we want a commercial vendor. And building familiarity is actually one of the best ways to reduce perceived risk. So perhaps in the enterprise, the advantage that open source has over other kinds of software is in building that familiarity at low cost. Use can then scale until external support is considered necessary. And by that time, hopefully, developers and users will have fallen in love with the product. I look forward to the discussion. I'll hand over to Colin.
Thank you, Duncan. So, I'm Colin, and I learned the art of doing something fast from Dick Hart.
Oh, really?
At OSCON many years ago, he works in this thing called Identity 2.0, and he gave a keynote, a 15-minute keynote with about 120 slides. So I'm going to try to do vaguely that. So the premise is that I come from a developer standpoint. We talked about MariaDB earlier, and I actually was on the co-founding team of MariaDB Server. And before that, I also worked in MySQL. So if you hate your databases in the MySQL ecosystem, there's someone you can throw eggs at, but please don't. So there's generally a premise that you start with a popular open source project, and then you decide that maybe at some stage it's time to make money, and then you form a corporation around it. And that's actually good business, right? As Duncan was saying, you'd actually probably want to make sure that you have a corporation backing you. But typically then you end up raising venture capital if you want to grow fast, and then you hire a sales team, and they always typically state that you end up needing an enterprise spin-off of some sort to bemoan the community edition. But this is not necessarily how things work, because you end up potentially getting forks and so forth. I think Red Hat is an excellent example. More than 16 years ago, they decided to split Red Hat Linux into Fedora Core and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. I presume a lot of you here are familiar with Red Hat Enterprise Linux and probably use it in production. And maybe your developers are quite happy playing around with Fedora and building what's next. But generally speaking, most people in enterprises would end up using the paid Red Hat Enterprise Linux subscription. I started using Red Hat Linux actually in 1996 with the Colgate release via Cheap Bytes. Don't know how many of you remember this, but back then you only paid for the distribution of the CD, and it cost maybe $1. Obviously, you can't develop Linux and support it for $1. Red Hat actually goes down fairly well. To tell you that Fedora benefits the community, RHEL is built by Red Hat itself alongside the community for enterprise IT. The community collaborates with Red Hat engineering, and it's a mutually beneficial relationship with rapid innovation. Fedora obviously has QA, and they've released 29 releases since the start of the project. I'm happy to say that I was actually at the start of the project as well. I was on the first FESCO. Red Hat got many things right. For one, they did not name it Red Hat Linux Community and Red Hat Linux Enterprise. Branding was distinct, Fedora and RHEL. This obviously gave you less confusion. It also meant that the community was not seen as a second-class citizen because it had its own branding, logos, events like FudCon, not Fiat City and Dalt, but Fedora Users and Developers Conference. And it also helps the sales team out as well as marketing. So I think this was a very smart strategy when it came to splitting things up. MySQL. Very successful company, I'd say. It started off success with OEM licensing and dual licensing, basically, eventually, so that you would end up having to pay for a license if you want to embed the MySQL connector. Of course, this business doesn't exist anymore, largely because I think SQLite largely killed the OEM business. I think all of you here in this room have access to a SQLite database in your pocket or handbag or purse, largely because SQLite runs on pretty much every mobile phone out there. But rewind back to maybe even 2005, and MySQL used to run on Motorola phones. So there were reasons to dual license, and this was basically a way to figure out a way to make money. And then eventually, it was decided that we should probably make an enterprise release. But you actually got nothing in the enterprise release except the string that said MySQL Enterprise. This is not a good way to split a community or offer subscription or get people to buy your product, because people look beyond just the enterprise tag. The community reacted fairly negatively to this, largely because non-vetted code was actually going into the enterprise release. So if you were paying MySQL, you were getting access to non-vetted code, and you were actually encountering bugs and regressions before the community got access to it. This is the reverse Fedora Red Hat model, which generally seemed kind of useless. And even better, naturally, what would happen is a community that is so actively using your product would end up just forking or releasing the binaries that they could get as part of the enterprise subscription because the GPL allowed them to do that. MySQL was, in my opinion, saved by an acquisition. Because back then we had nothing besides an enterprise monitor that we were developing. When Oracle purchased Sun, they could also integrate the backup product, which they had already purchased before in 2005, because they got the major storage engine. And nowadays, you obviously get access to plugins, authentication plugins, audits, thread pools, and so forth. We went wrong in MySQL in many ways. But for one was we underestimated our community of users and developers. MySQL became the world's most popular open source database because of our users and developers. And we obviously underestimated the fact that the community QA was very, very good. Many eyes make bugs shallow, right? And it turns out that if many people use it and encounter problems, they report it or they fix it. In fact, this is probably the reason why MySQL today runs on 19 of the top 20 websites on the Alexa ranking. It's because throughout the valley, there is a shared understanding and knowledge of how to hack MySQL without having to pay a vendor. Why 19 out of 20? Bing is one of them, and I don't think they use MySQL. Don't necessarily listen to your sales teams because you want to make sure that the community version is not actually the untrusted version. We didn't make individual branding. This was clearly a mistake. And you obviously, if you're going to sell something, provide value. Otherwise, the buyer is not going to find the value in paying, except for insurance purposes. Don't know how many of you remember Eucalyptus. Yep. So Eucalyptus was an open source compatible API to Amazon Web Services. And they decided to go open core. And you get fully functional services of the Eucalyptus cloud, but you'll actually have to pay for additional enterprise features. Turns out the moment they announced the open core model, NASA, which was the major user of Eucalyptus, said they're going to fork, well, not fork, they're going to create a new project called OpenStack. A few years later, Eucalyptus went back to a full open source movement, and then they sold to HP, where the financial terms weren't disclosed. I guess you can all know what that means. OpenStack is still very much alive and kicking. They have had their nth summit just this week, and nobody talks about Eucalyptus anymore, not even HP.
Nobody's talking about OpenStack anymore either, are they?
Well, yeah, I'm not so sure. We have Reddit in the audience. They just integrated Kubernetes into OpenStack and announced it like this week. Or was it last week?
Well, there'll be a lot of people in Berlin today and
And
tomorrow.
there's a huge gathering of people at OpenStack gathering in Berlin. True, the Kubernetes meetups are probably even larger now. But
Yeah, just commented, it's not really called OpenStack Summit anymore.
It's Open Infrastructure
Open
Summit.
Infrastructure
Is it
Summit.
changed?
Yeah.
Oh my
It's very
goodness.
exciting.
Yes.
Well, there you go.
So max scale.
But it's the Kubernetes that's driving the current growth.
Let's come back to this topic, shall we?
Yeah.
Let's do this.
We can discuss this in the 20 minutes we have afterwards. So max scale. There are plenty of markets for proxies, and everyone says we need to load balance our MySQL servers. So there are 3 proxies, and Oracle provides one, the community provides another, and MariaDB provided one as well, and still provides. In fact, it just changed licenses. It changed licenses to become time-delayed open source, and it was not the first time this happened. The GoScript Aladdin license back in the mid-90s had this as well, where it became GPL after year, and Stallman himself said, I considered it a problematical compromise, at least it gave us free software after a year. This was 20 years ago, basically. The BSL actually tells you that you have an additional use grant, which basically says that if you need to use it for any use case where you have 3 servers, you end up paying a license fee. Quick aside is that this is a GitHub check-in of what it looks like to have an open source product where people check in code around 8 to 5 or 6 p.m. And this is what it looks like to have an open source project where people check in pretty much all the time except maybe on a weekend. There were no forks on MaxScale, largely because there were alternatives for you to use. So if you today want to use a proxy that's open source, you can use proxy SQL. But that doesn't mean that people actually in the enterprise care about the open source nature of things. They care about, will I be getting support and what additional functionality can I get? And it turns out Mysql is doing quite well. However, what could have been done better is early warning versus shock and awe. Shock and awe is something you never want to have. Cloud beats open source. Pretty much every project you get today is available in the cloud, be it Amazon's cloud, Microsoft's cloud, Alibaba's cloud, and so forth. In fact, RDS MySQL makes more money than all MySQL providers combined. Redis Labs basically employs the creator of Redis. They've raised a lot of money, and they're BSD licensed, but they have access to the trademark. And they decided to actually basically add a commons clause to the Apache 2 license, which is very clearly not Apache 2 license, and lots of people complained about this. And they said the AGPL did not work for them, the Affero GPL did not work for them, because cloud providers were offering managed services for them. Google actually has a policy that clearly states you can never use AGPL software, even on your employee-provided laptop, for example. So I'm not so sure if the AGPL is being accepted as much. Redis isn't doing poorly either, keep that in mind. As soon as they renamed their company, they actually ended up having a huge amount of year-over-year growth or quarter-over-quarter growth, double digits for the 10th consecutive quarter. It was driven by their VCs. They've already raised Series D, and Bain Capital Ventures says Amazon and others cannot continue abusing open source. The community reacted. They forked all the modules. So you can still access it via a community-supported version. MongoDB is got an extremely successful business model as well. They took the company public fairly recently, and I think they're a very successful open source company because they built all these SaaS solutions around it. They've not only focused on the core database product, but then they've also decided to announce something called a server-side public license because they decided the AGPL was not sufficient to protect them from cloud providers. This is probably important for all of you as well because you probably are going to run MongoDB as a service and provide it internally to your customers, and it's not entirely clear what happens there. And why I say it's not entirely clear is because this is happening as we speak. It only happened about a month ago, and they're still waiting to see if there's OSI approval. So if you're actually interested, there's a license discuss mailing list. There's a long, long thread of discussions about why the SSPL should not be accepted as an OSI license. Many corporations tell you to sign a contributor license agreement, and many corporations that want to contribute to open source like yours may not want to because the lawyers are not very interested in a CLA. And this actually allows the commercial owner of the product to market versions of the product under an open source and non-free license, and this may not necessarily work. But generally speaking, there are many dual license products out there, from Eucalyptus, MySQL, and so forth. So maybe there is no canonical open source business model. Open source is a development model. I think that's really very important to take away. You still make money with open source, obviously. You can sell and buy subscriptions. I mean, that's exactly what most people end up doing. Red Hat's a very successful subscription services business. You can do a license. Professional services. SaaS is a great business model as well. You can sell proprietary plugins. Time-delayed open source may work. It worked previously, it may still work today. Or advertising partnerships. But if you don't want to piss your community off, the people that are actually using your software, the developers, because everyone here today is going to probably play around with software. You're going to implement software with what your developers have chosen, is don't give them shock and awe. Respect the community. Provide, obviously, real differentiation. And obviously provide the community to give you feedback before you actually make changes. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to Diane to give you the view from the actual enterprise side.
All right. Just hook up my slides here.
I'll plug it in for you.
I'll keep my supply of water handy. So I So I really like the title of the program today for this slot because it is complicated. And thank you both for doing a great job introing it. I'm Diane Mueller. I'm the Director of Community Development for the Cloud Platform BU, but really what I focus on is the OpenShift, open source community development and all of the stuff and all of the relationships around that. So I'm here to tell you that it is really complicated. I'm not going to focus so much on the licensing side of things, though one of my very first jobs was working for Descartes at ActiveState, going through all of the Python libraries for our distribution that was sold as an enterprise offering. So I've got some deep understanding of licensing issues and a great love of the legal department. Let's see. So I'm not going to belabor the point about OpenShift and open source and Red Hat, but we have made a very successful company based on an open source ethos, and one of the many projects and products that we work with is RHEL, which I'm betting that most of you in the finance sector have under the hood somewhere at your enterprises. And so we've been really trying to help you bring that open source innovation to the enterprise. And that's not an easy thing to do. We work with all of your legal departments, all of your different officers in audit and compliance, and helping you bring those things to the enterprise. Our ethos is really around all, not just open source and open sourcing the code, but also having open communities and collaborating with multiple communities. So we will have that, yes, the code is out in public, but in a GitHub repo or in some source code repository in which we all share things. But it is also about having that openness in the governance and openness to collaborate with other communities, sometimes competing communities. That's really doing it. And we always at Red Hat, I love this diagram because it really talks about how much in the DNA of Red Hat open source is. And it also points out the number of projects that Red Hat has its finger in. And we talk, mostly we focus on cloud offerings and RHEL and Linux, but there are millions of projects, and I kid you not, that Red Hat has someone contributing to somewhere in Red Hat over the history of Red Hat. So it's really not just about Linux here. And consuming open source is not trivial. And what we are really hoping and have been doing is really to try and bring it to the enterprise, to make it so that you have the services and the support and things that you need in order to deliver that to your customers, but also that we are representing ourselves in lots of different places, like FINOS or FINOS. I'm always going to think you need an operating system here soon underneath FINOS. But really, it's about working with all the different parties, whether it's the Linux Foundation or Open Banking or one of the many other projects at a foundational level, or at the underpinnings in the individual project. But there's a lot of things that go on and a lot of complications. There's a lot of upstream dynamics that we have to work with. And one of the reasons is that code is a living and breathing thing, though I might not be able to breathe because I have this cold here and I may cough a lot today. But there are lots of changes being made and lots of code updates and push and pull requests and lots of contributions being made and keeping track of them. And somebody mentioned earlier, Kubernetes is one of the most active projects that I've ever worked on, and it's under the hood of the OpenShift project as well. But there are, at the moment, I think this is probably a little out of date, 877. I think this is about 2-3 months old, and it's probably almost halved again with the number of contributors to it. But the real key here is, for Red Hat, is we put a lot of resources on these projects that are working on them. Almost 50% of the OpenShift programmers and coders that are working on OpenShift inside of Red Hat are making direct contributions to Kubernetes. So we have a real tight relationship with that, but we also are doing a lot of bug fixes and making sure that things work really nicely, not just for people who are using OpenShift, which is Red Hat's Kubernetes distribution, but also for everybody else. So it's an interesting balance that we have. And in maintaining that and also driving a business, we mentioned earlier that I think it was IBM, so probably Google was the first largest contributor, but Red Hat has a ton of people working on Kubernetes itself. We've done now 11 releases of OpenShift, which is a Kubernetes distribution, so every time Kubernetes puts out another release, which is on a 3-month cycle now, we have to vet it, run it through our test processes, and make sure that it gets recertified as a Kubernetes certified offering. And all of that takes a lot of coordination. And so there's tons of people that are working at the SIG level. So a special interest group or a working group within the Kubernetes community. A lot of them are working from Red Hat, but there's not just the leads in there. There's over 40 groups inside of Kubernetes that are working on different aspects of Kubernetes. The red ones are ones in which we have one of the co-chairs is there, but we have resources on every single one of these projects at the moment. So it's pretty extensive, the amount of effort and resources that Red Hat puts into this project. So we, though people know us mostly for RHEL and for Linux, we didn't really stop at Linux. And Linux is really the underpinning of almost every cloud, but it's also been a number of other projects that have come out of it that we've spun into making products. So we didn't really stop there, and we just kept going. Because from our perspective, Linux is what makes all of this possible. From that, we created an offering that was enterprise Linux. We went into KVMs. From that, we started moving into the cloud. And now we're projecting into the open hybrid cloud, which will enable you to run multiple workloads on in-house on-prem clouds or on anybody else's, AWS, or Google, or any other cloud as well. Then we come back to containers, and there's a whole lot of work being done there around another foundational project offering called OCI, the Open Container Initiative. And then we get to Kubernetes, which I think is the poster child right now for every software development offering right now. And it is also the underpinning of OKD, and that's really, okay, and I always say, we just recently renamed our open source project to OKD, and I think everybody's did it was OK Diane, because I argued so much about what it should be called, so I think of it as OKD Diane. But really, what happened was about 5 years ago, we had a platform as a service offering, which was OpenShift, and it was called OpenShift Origin. And when Kubernetes came out, we really pivoted very quickly and built out our whole infrastructure on top of Kubernetes. So from a community manager's point of view, which is what the nature of my job is we really had to get involved deeply with that project. And so everything that we are now a Kubernetes distribution, and we're certified. That changed the nature of our project. So instead of being a single offering that was pretty much very Red Hat focused, most of the resources working on the original project were OpenShift developers. That changed the whole nature of how we related to other communities and how we collaborated with other communities. So it got complicated, but in some ways it got easier because we had more people collaborating with us, more voices looking at the code base, and expanded our community much bigger. So if you think about what we're doing, besides having the Kubernetes folks involved in this, so Kubernetes is a big chunk of what it is, but there's a whole lot of other things that run on and in and under OpenShift. So we also touch on all of these other communities, and we do that. We have over 100 integrations that we have to deal with, and as the community manager, I have to manage those relationships, manage the release cycles, and know when those are all aligned in time. so that we know when things are getting pushed out. And then these get pushed out into our actual product offerings. The interesting thing is we do what we call open source first, so everything gets pushed into the open source repo, but it gets tested almost immediately on OpenShift Online. So we have a hosted offering called OpenShift Online and one called OpenShift Dedicated, which is the managed one, managed service provider. But we have tens of thousands of developers who are instantly guinea pigging our new code releases each time. So we have all of those relationships that we have to manage. Besides that, we have a whole universe of people who are now developing and deploying applications inside of enterprises. So the complication of managing all of these relationships has been pretty significant. So it's not just Red Hat building code in a vacuum. Everything has changed, and this is out of date even now. We have over 450 members in an organization. Pretty quickly through this. What we've had to do in order to make this work is create sort of a new cross-community collaboration model. So if you think of what a traditional community manager is, maybe from Mysql or one of the other projects we've mentioned, they're all about trying to get code contribution to their individual project. In our case, we're trying to make sure that the communication lines between all of these different communities and all of the different projects that feed into OKD and OpenShift and the product offerings are all aligned and communicating well. So we've really tried to do, you've got to think about what the fire hose is now of information that's coming through this project and the projects that are next to it. And so we've got tons of, I think I've done over 150 briefings this past year. They're all up on YouTube. We have weekly community meetings for not just for OpenShift, but we're also involved in the Kubernetes ones, a lot of the other CNCF projects as well. And we have a very, very active Slack channel. And I know in finance, not a lot of you get to use Slack because it's behind a firewall and all of that, but we'll talk about that in another session a little bit later this afternoon called Overcoming Barriers to Collaboration. So that we'll talk a little bit about how to get access to all that. But the very interesting thing about this is when we did this whole pivot to a new open community model and doing all this clustering, that the contribution, the thing that community managers hype on the most or get bonused on the most was exponential. So by changing the model from very much focused on contribute to my thing, we actually changed the whole ethos of that because we had so many more eyeballs on our project. We have over 70 companies external to Red Hat now contributing to the OpenShift code base. So actually getting that stuff vetted by people who we probably weren't collaborating as closely with when we were a single project that was just hosted, I think originally it was Ruby on Rails on a MongoDB project. And so we really shifted. When we joined and brought Kubernetes into the conversation around what OpenShift is, everything changed. So we have we've tried to really help the conversations go by being very virtual, but I am here in person, so I do fly. We have one of the most active Slack channels that I've ever participated in, and that's really sort of an amazing thing to go in there and have people from all walks of life, all of the different companies that are computing and using for this are really moving very, very fast to help and support other people and answer questions. So what the future for open source really looks like is about collaboration and collaboration in the upstream, the things that feed our products and create this. It's also, I wanted to really point out that it's across multiple streams. So if any of you have participated in the Cloud Native Foundation, you know that they're continuing this chart. There's no way to keep this slide up to date because they're always adding in new projects that are part of this ecosystem. And we're doing a lot with a lot of other projects because all of these things, whether it's Jaeger and Open Tracing that are helping us do the monitoring of OpenShift deployments, these are the real things that this really push it. And it's not just about the code. And I think I can't emphasize that enough, is that it's really about the people who are using the projects and them getting involved. And so the companies like yourselves that are using OpenShift, I can't tell you how much of value gets added to our product offerings by people external to Red Hat who are using it and bringing that wealth of information and feedback into the offering. So OpenShift Commons, join us. We can get you on that Slack channel if you have permission. Otherwise, we'll figure out something else. Lots of things happening. We'll be back here in London on January 30th doing an OpenShift Commons gathering. I know that's my limit. I got a little hand sign going there. So I'm going to stop and let you guys ask questions of the three of us. And really thank you for listening to us. And I'm so pleased that I didn't cough too much through that.